This is a very exciting day for us, I think, to have Dan here. In my experience in online, there have been some real landmarks, one of which was a statement by Matt Welch when he said to the traditional media, "Watch out, we're going to fact-check your ass." And that has gone down as a famous statement that historians are going to look back on and no doubt use. The second famous statement was made by our speaker when very soon after he began his column at the San Jose Mercury, stated flat out, "My readers know more than I do." And I think that was really a turning point, in my estimation. That was a turning point in the internet and communications, because it was an open acknowledgement that the audience was more powerful than the content provider, and that the balance had to be redressed. There's just a couple other things that stick in my mind. One is that there have, over the years, been two things that have really driven this medium. One is the capacity of getting data through to the users. And when we started out in 1982, we had 900 baud modems. If you can imagine trying to push graphics through at 900 baud. And now at...
I started out with 300.
300. Oh, well, there's always somebody who can trump you, you know. So, and now, what would be if we're translating baud, what would be the top rate that we get on a good internet?
Well, you're on internet too here, so
yeah.
You know, unlimited.
Unlimited. So we have now, even in the homes and in the offices and in your residence halls, we have the capacity to bring through video and bring through audio and, in effect, make this a true multimedia. And it's extraordinary to see this happening so quickly, and the influence that is having on online. But the second major thrust that is happening is the thrust towards citizen and community journalism. And it is really transforming the communication scene. And nobody is better to address this than our speaker. And I'm going to turn the podium over to Robert Niles, our online journalism review editor, who's going to introduce the speaker.
Double introduction. 2 people.
Yes.
Something it takes 2 people. Dan Gilmor has worked as a columnist for the newspaper up in San Jose Mercury and for their widely read, lauded SiliconValley.com website. His blog became must-read for people who are interested in the development of the internet and online journalism. Recently, he has set off on his own, putting together a site called Bayosphere.com that is organizing citizen journalism efforts up in the Bay Area. But he's always been a very active voice in championing and soliciting people to become participants in journalistic media rather than simply passive observers. So he's got a lot to say on this topic, so I'll shut up and let him start talking.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be asked here and to visit with you guys. I'm going to really whip through these slides. I won't spend a whole bunch of time on each one of them. This is a talk that can take as long as 3 hours if I decide to do it that way, but you don't want to do that. And I'm really more interested in hearing what you want to hear about when we do a Q&A and learning things from you. But let me just take you through the landscape as I see it and how it sort of occurred to me that this was going on and the things that I've done about it. You start off old media, new media, and I think there's something called we media, which is this grassroots, bottom-up phenomenon, stems from ubiquitous networks that are not here but are coming very, very inexpensive and getting more inexpensive all the time and easier to use and more powerful tools that mean that anybody can be a publisher. And that's a fairly profound and new idea, that not only just can you be a publisher, but you can publish to a global audience or nearly so. And that this is a manifestation of something that the web was not at the beginning, it was not a read and write phenomenon. It was a read-only thing for the first, 5 or 6 years of the web, where you were kind of reading stuff from it, but writing on it was kind of hard. Now it's pretty easy to write on the web almost as easily as we read from it, and that means big, big changes. And it's blogs, but it's way, way more than blogs. Blogs are getting all the attention, but it's important that we understand that this is, the blogs are the first instance of this read-write phenomenon where it was truly easy, but they're not the last, and they're kind of the precursor of what's coming. And things that are in this area, the SMS and podcasts and video, and that, one thing I won't spend much time on in this talk is the newsmakers, the people, the institutions that we journalists have been writing about for a long time. Something new is being done to them as a result of all this, but they also can use these same tools to do something that they've never done, or at least not very well, which is to speak with a human voice and in a transparent way to their own constituents, and something I hope they will start doing more. Let me take you through my quick history, personal history of understanding how this works. This is a screenshot I did in 2000 when I teach in Hong Kong every fall for a month or so. And it was on Wednesday morning in Hong Kong in 2000, November 2000. It was election night here in the U.S. And you may recall there was a really kind of weird election going on where nobody knew who was even ahead, much less the winner. Now, I didn't have access to to U.S. TV, and the local stations were not spending much time on the election. So I went on the web to do the best I could, and I realized what I could do on the web was pretty damn good. That up in the left corner there is a real audio stream. I found National Public Radio's live feed over the web. So I was listening to that and then bouncing around from one site to another for more detail. CNN, the Post, the Times, the Mercury for California stuff. It was just whatever I could find and getting the best by mixing and matching. And I realized all of a sudden I was getting a better news report about the election than anybody who was watching TV inside the U.S. because I was putting together the best sources and getting the best I could get. This doesn't sound very revolutionary today, but in 2000 this sort of blew my mind. And I realized if I could figure that out, anybody could figure that out, and that something pretty interesting was changing. September 11th, okay, we all know how we first saw what was going on television. It quickly got onto the web. Other things started happening. I was at the time in South Africa, in fact, with Adam here. We were on among a group of journalists who were, and Jay, my God, there's three of us who were in the same van hearing about this. And we were on our way from South Africa to Zambia, and we were doing workshops for journalists there. And the next few days was blurry, but one way I was getting information about what was going on was through email, and in particular through a list run by a guy named Dave Farber, who's a famous technologist, and he has a list called Interesting People. One of the messages that came to his list the day after was he basically takes stuff from his audience of 100,000 or so and sends out the things he thinks are interesting. So he's an editor. And one of the things he sent out was a satellite, link to a satellite image of Lower Manhattan that gave a sense of the scope of this thing that I didn't see in other places. It was just another way of seeing what the event was. The bloggers were really active then. One blog in Brooklyn, across the river from the Trade Center, one young guy blogging said, "Now I know what a burning city smells like." And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, they used to say journalists write the first draft of history. That guy did. And we need to keep that in mind too. At the same time, a guy in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, named Tamim Ansari, Afghan-American, been in the U.S. for about 20 years. He sent an email to a few of his friends, an impassioned email about what he believed and what was going to happen. He basically said, I know you're going to invade my country, but before you do, here's a few things to understand about my country. That email, those few friends sent it to a few of their friends each, and on it, it made its way out like branches on a tree. And after about 10 days, this guy was not only being published in mass media, but he was on TV, national television, having kind of created himself instantly as a source. A fascinating occurrence. Fast forward 15 months to Trent Lott and the famous birthday party for Strom Thurmond, where Lott, who was then head of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate, makes a racist comment. Well, the mass media kind of ignored it. They touched it, but basically didn't do anything with it. The bloggers went nuts, just nuts. And the left-wing ones first, saying, this is outrageous. He made a racist comment. Nobody seems to care. Then some right-wing bloggers picked up on it, saying, you know, that's true. He doesn't speak for me. And it started to filter its way back into the mainstream media. Now, there were other things going on, like some targeted emails from some Democratic operatives at the time. But the bloggers fed enough of this fury back to the mass media that it got picked up again, and then he lost his political support and had to step down from that position. It was not that the bloggers brought him down. The bloggers had a role, and that was what I'm trying to get at. There was a symbiosis here, not a direct result, but it was very important. Another data point or two from the space shuttle tragedy in February of 2003. Another data point here is another satellite image that I saw nowhere else. And I circled, it's a weather satellite. I circled that area in red. That's the debris field of the shuttle coming back through the atmosphere. Again, another resonant image, one that was not standard media, but one that actually made a difference that day in understanding what had happened. More importantly, the same day, on a email list that space buffs hang out on, a former engineer for NASA, the space agency, put up a note saying, you know, something hit the left wing on the ascent when the thing was taking off, and maybe that had something to do with it. Well, in fact, that was the cause. And it was from somebody who knew what he was talking about, making informed speculation. This was data. Was it journalism? I don't know. But it was important in the understanding and the quick understanding from the grassroots of what might have happened here. Again, I thought something's going on. And it all comes down to something that I realized over a period of a few years, which is that journalism's changing from the lecture mode, where we tell you stuff like I'm doing now, to a conversation or a seminar where the publication is not the end of the story, but kind of the middle. Because then we take that publication and we talk about it, and we move on to something even better. And as Larry mentioned at the start, my foundation principle in this new thing is that my readers know more than I do, which is something I discovered instantly upon moving to Silicon Valley a decade ago, where I was writing about technology. And they all had email even then, and believe me, they weren't shy about letting me know that they knew more than I did, because I would get this flood of email when I'd make a mistake or miss something or whatever. And after being daunted by that for a few times, I suddenly realized, well, wait a minute, I'm a journalist, and what do? I find out stuff, and I put it in the paper. Oh, this is useful. And it was a great moment when I didn't get worried about the readers knowing more than I did, but to embrace it. And I think all journalists really need to do that, because it's true for all journalists, no matter what they cover. And I have an anecdote about a reader knowing more than me and how it had a little impact in an event. This is Joe Naccio. He was then the CEO of Quest. It's the big phone company in the Mountain States. At Esther Dyson's PC Forum conference in 2002, he was on stage, this was in Arizona, and he was on stage kind of complaining about the rigors of raising capital in his market. And I was in the audience, so was another blogger, and there was a Wi-Fi network even then, and we were blogging in kind of real time. And I'm thinking, Joe's up there complaining, and he runs a monopoly, and I'm thinking, you know, how hard is that? So I put a note in the blog saying, you know, Joe's whining and it's unseemly, and you know, he shouldn't do that. I get an email a minute later from a guy who's reading our blogs in Florida, a lawyer who's in the software business. And he said, what a great country. And he sends us to a Yahoo Finance website that's the Securities and Exchange Commission database of insider stock trading. And it shows that Joe, while he's been running Quest, has sold several $100 million worth of shares. Well, that struck me as relevant. So I put it in the blog in the next minute and tipped my hat to the guy in Florida. And so did Doc Searles, the other blogger. And picture the situation. We're in a big room, lots of people with their computers open, maybe a third to half of them had their computers open. And a few of them, at least, were amusing themselves reading our blogs. And the mood starts to chill toward the stage, and it starts to spread this way. And I'm not the one who noticed this. Some people who were there, but certainly by the time the Q&A came around, the audience had turned downright surly toward Nacho. And Esther Dyson later wrote, it was her conference, she wrote later that the blogs had had an impact on this. I'm telling you this not because I'm cool or because Nacho learned something, though he did. But the really important, the hero of the story is the guy in Florida, the guy who formerly had just been a reader of what we do. He was reading what we do, but he knew something we didn't. He lets us know, we feed it back in, we check that it's authoritative or at least credible. We put it into the journalism. It goes out in some very quick, real-time way, and something changes. And for him, having moved from audience to participant was a big deal, too. And he talks about it when he goes around giving talks about his work. So he's the hero, not the rest of it. So as that would demonstrate, the newsmakers have some new opportunities and some lessons, and they really have to use them in a way. Some of the lessons for newsmakers and for journalists, too, is that fact-checking is really global now. I've got to change this slide. This site has been changed to something called SourceWatch. It's basically analyzing PR and marketing and telling you who's paying for it. And as one big news organization that's also a newsmaker found out, CBS News last year, this fact-checking being global, it's also getting pretty fast. No sooner had that report on Bush's National Guard service aired than people started raising questions about the authenticity of those memos that it was based on. I would note that the bloggers didn't just raise questions, they just asserted that these were frauds, something that still isn't proved one way or the other, but clearly CBS had done terrible journalism in this case by not verifying that these things were real. And the lack of verification to me is you don't put it on. It just doesn't, you don't do that. And they had to back off, but not before some real whining about it. And in fact, one former CBS executive was denigrating the bloggers as those people in pajamas. And you know, those people in pajamas became known as the pajama Hadeen. It was CBS really regretted that. Another thing that folks are learning in the corporate world is that the customers and their other constituents, they're not waiting for the press to tell them stuff. They're telling each other anyway. And this is an important point because the news now makes its way around without the help of journalists. And that's important. Another message is getting really hard to keep secrets, or harder than it used to be, unless you have the government at your backing. But even then it can fail. The minute these pictures in Abu Ghraib were on that CD, making their way out into the world, that was over. And it's important, and the Pentagon understood after initially reacting the wrong way, they finally understood they had to think about what that meant. Another important thing, SARS, the word of SARS in Guangdong province in China, the way it came out was not because the press covered it at first, but because people were sending SMS messages to each other, including doctors to some journalists, on their phones in that province. And the government tried to really step on the story, but couldn't. And I think that was important for them to realize. Options for the newsmakers in this new world. If you're going into journalism, think about this. After September 11th, the Post did a series, one of their million-word series on this, in this case, what the top folks in government were doing and thinking at the time. The minute the series was in the paper and on the web, the Pentagon on its website posted the full transcript of the interview that Bob Woodward and Dan Baltz did with Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, all many thousand words of it. And it turned out, I thought that was a fantastic thing, and I called them and said, well, do you do this all the time? It turns out they do it with every major interview that Rumsfeld gives. This is not the most pleasant thought for journalists, to know that everything that we've done in an interview is going to make its way to the web. But I think on balance, this is a good thing, and we ought to face it and enjoy it and realize it's going to be part of the way things work. If organizations that do this ought to be doing it consistently. Last year, the Pentagon, after another Woodward interview with Rumsfeld, they excised one little embarrassing snippet from the interview before they put up the transcript, at which point the Washington Post said, well, okay, and put up its own transcript with the little snippet restored, and then wrote a story about it, pointing out, making something that no one would have really cared about particularly, but now making a big deal out of it. So the messages be honorable and consistent. I could spend a week on this slide, I won't, but in this medium, truth doesn't always catch up with falsehoods, or at least not quickly enough, and we have to find ways and really work on this to help it happen. One thing media, I believe, should be doing is asking people for help, and they're doing it now, which is great. After the space shuttle accident, the NASA asked people for photographs they might have in order to help with the investigation, set up an FTP site to get the pictures. The BBC saw that and said, wow, that's a cool idea, a couple of years ago, before the Iraq War started, and asked people for pictures about family life connected to the military, and got a wonderful photo essay out of it. But importantly, and by the way, after Katrina, every big news organization was asking people for their pictures. It's now routine, and I'm glad it is. But one thing to keep in mind is that the readers, they'll do it whether we ask them or not. This is not, they don't care. This is the Australian embassy in Jakarta that was bombed last year by terrorists, and this is a photo taken by someone passing by who had it on Flickr, the photo sharing website, long before the established media in Indonesia had it anywhere near their own sites or publications or broadcasts. And this is now the canonical picture from the London Underground bombing. A guy with his cell phone camera. This picture was on the front page of newspapers around the world. Guy in the tube takes the shot, emails it to, I think, the BBC in this case, and it's out there. So this was a case where the media, big and little, work together, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. Some of the tools and toys people are using. I'm fond of this one, the satellite uplink in a suitcase. I want one. And let me just show you a video.
This is stomach medicine. You can take this medicine together. This is headache medicine. The date for use of this medicine has expired.
Okay, I took this at Ken Sakamura's ubiquitous computing lab in Tokyo a couple of years ago. He's putting little radio tags into everyday objects, then connecting them to databases to get more information about what the object is. In this case, it was a pharmaceutical prescription, and it's a demonstration, not a real product, but the idea was the prescription you just were about to buy conflicts with something else you're taking, so don't do that. An interesting example, Mark Smith up at Microsoft Research has one that's more current, really, because they're just using off-the-shelf technology like barcodes, a handheld, a scanner. So they went to the supermarket with this little experimental thing, then they scanned a box of cereal, and they went to the barcode database, got the product name, then it went to Google to get results from Google about that product. Well, the first result on Google was that the product had been recalled. And the reason it had been recalled was that in the cereal was an ingredient that had not made it to the list of ingredients on the box, and it turned out that ingredient was, in some very tiny percent of the population, deadly. And Mark, as Mark said to me after, he said, you know, if he said there are two messages. One is that not just every person can tell a story in this new world, but everything can tell a story. And if the story is, I'm going to kill you if you eat me, you kind of want to hear that ahead of time. More tools and toys. Move on to, with really cheap video cameras now, we can do very professional looking stuff. And people are doing it. MoveOn did a bunch of things for before the election, Bush in 30 Seconds, where they asked people to do anti-Bush commercials, and this was the one of the.
Implemented a lie about weapons of mass destruction as a pretext to invade another country. I'll call myself an environmentalist and gut clean air standards. Our allies will go from respecting us to hating us, and I don't care. I'll leave no child behind. Unless they can't afford it. I promise to keep you in a state of fear and anxiety, so you never question what we're doing. And if you do, we'll call you unpatriotic.
I kept hoping there would be some equivalent on the right. I mean, Kerry, oh God, what could have been done with Kerry? But this is, the point of it is that with cheap equipment and a computer like this for editing, you can do things of that quality quite easily. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone's a good actor or that this is not easy to do, but it's getting easier all the time. So let me quickly talk about newsrooms of the future in some small way. Some of them are assembling themselves without any particular intervention or guidance. This is called the command post that was set up for the Iraq War. Basically, they were just trying to assemble every new item of information they could find. And it became a site that journalists covering the war actually found quite useful. And so did a lot of other folks who just wanted to see what was going on. They've added politics, and it's brilliant. The conventions last year, they accredited bloggers for the first time, and it was sort of a parlor trick designed mainly to get coverage of how the parties were now listening to the people or something like that. And the main outcome from this was not great stories from the bloggers, but coverage about them blogging from the mass media that treated them like pets. You know, oh, cute little blogger. And I think over time we'll get through this, and bloggers, some of them are doing brilliant journalism, some of them are not, and we'll just, if we want journalism, we'll go to the good stuff. This is the most important experiment today in bottom-up content. It's called Wikipedia. Wikis are websites anyone can write and edit any page. I'm in awe of what these guys have accomplished. It is not perfect, but it is extraordinarily important, and the community that works here is, I go to school on this to learn about community online. Tomorrow's news, do you all know what RSS is? It's the file format that lets you read stuff in a browser. All of those on the left are websites. Those are headlines from a website. That's the content from one of the headlines. So you can see I can go through a lot of stuff really fast, just getting headlines. Then if I want to read an article, I don't have to go from site to site. There are many implications of this, one of which is that your content looks kind of like everyone else's content and is in the same place. So Joe's weblog and the New York Times can be right next to each other. And I think that's great if I think Joe's weblog is just as good as something I'm seeing in the Times. But it sort of roils the waters for people who think that importance is determined by circulation or Nielsen numbers. So anyway, RSS, this is an efficient, an incredibly efficient way to read or at least scan a great deal of information. It's one of the futures of news. Everyone is incorporating RSS into what they do now. And I assume that you will all be using it. So one of the things about it is really adaptable. I have an RSS reader for my phone. And you can get headlines and short summaries of things in a nice format. And you don't have to create different files for it to be viewable in a good way on many different devices. That's one of the advantages of RSS. How does anyone make money at these things? This is my 1999 business model, where the more you lost, the more you were worth. I fear that we're returning to those days in some of the Silicon Valley things I'm watching now, but I'm holding my breath. But people are actually making businesses out of this new way of doing things, of listening to the citizens. This is the other big important experiment in the world right now. It's called Oh My News. It's in Seoul, Korea. It has a professional staff of reporters and editors, but a small one. And most of the editors spend most of their time editing stories submitted by citizen reporters, as they call them. And they basically do think of a nation of stringers and you've kind of got it. But every story has a discussion attached to it. It's much more than just standard stringers doing feeds to big publications. These guys are path-breaking in so many ways. I don't have time to detail them, but what they're doing is extremely important. People should pay attention. Other ways are just the sort of nano-publishing. This is actually a site based here in LA that is part of a company that was just sold to AOL, so there's a revenue model. Another one that patronage used to be the way people got things done in the arts and letters, and this is a case where it's patronage from the people. Chris Albritton, the former AP reporter, before the Iraq War started, said he had been in Iraq and written about it. He said, "Send me money and I'll go cover the Iraq War." And people sent him money, $15,000 or so, and he went back and did a great job. And he ended up with a job at Time, I think, so there's another revenue model. Making sense of this global emergent conversation is really hard. And the tools still kind of suck. We're still working on that, and it'll take many years for it to get better. But there's things like Feedster, which only indexes RSS, and Technorati, which only indexes blogs. They're way over like 15 million now. There are tools that are getting useful. I use them basically to, one way I use them is to track what people say about my book, and it's fantastically useful. We need better tools, though, in a lot of ways, like conversations, tracking conversations, making them work better. And I could talk a long time about some of the things that are missing in this sphere. Much of it's being worked on by people in Silicon Valley and around the world, and down here as well. My one little political moment, which is to remind us all that the web is a read-write medium, and I'm in the backyard of Hollywood, and I want to remind you how Hollywood tends to view the internet, which is that. And it's not just a television with volume and channel buttons. Hollywood's added a new button that they call interactivity, which is to buy things. This is not interactivity. This is I'm worried about the state of copyright law in particular, but other intellectual property laws. I honor copyright and believe in it, but I think we're abusing it to stop what's called piracy, which is actually copyright infringement, which is not the same thing. And we need to remember that innovation and creation of new things invariably are built upon prior innovation and prior creativity. We all stand on each other's shoulders. And if copyright law means that fair use is something that the copyright holder gets to decide whether we have, that's very dangerous. That's very, very dangerous. And it could kill journalism or make it a lot harder. If we have to get permission just to quote people or have to pay people just to quote people from other media, as you really do with video, then we're in really deep, deep trouble. So the reason I worry about this, again, is that this is problematic for new entrants in just the business side, but it's even more problematic for creativity and journalism and all of the things that I really do care about. And the thing I'm going to leave you with, the final little video, is that I come from a world of text mostly and pictures, and I'm learning all the new things, but I'm not fluent in them the way people your age and younger are, the students in the room. And we need to remember that there's a new medium being developed here, and we have to promote its future and not restrict it. And this is a piece of commentary that was created by some satirists who work on the web. And it's not something you would have seen from anyone my age, probably. But I think it's the kind of thing we need to encourage more of, but copyright law really makes this impossible.
Your every breath that I take, your every breath I make, and I want to share all my love with you. No one else will do. And your eyes, they tell me how much you care. Oh,
That's the future. And I love that. And we need more of that. We got to protect it and make sure we get more of that, not stamp it out while we're waiting. And that's how you can contact me easily, and please do. And if you're contacting me from this session, please put USC or something in the subject line so I can flag it and know that it's from this room. I usually have a shameless promotion slide of my book cover, but I'll point out that the book was published under a Creative Commons license, which is a copyright license that says some rights reserved, not all rights reserved. And in our case, the book is freely downloadable from the web and for non-commercial uses. And on the principle that if anyone's going to make money on it, we kind of would rather it be us. But it hasn't seemed to hurt sales, and it's been more widely available as a result. And is now in many other languages that, so it doesn't hurt. I honor copyright, I just don't like its abuse. That's the point of that last little bit. I would love to hear your questions, and let's talk some about the future. Anybody? Right there.
I'm wondering, you seem to draw a distinction between professional journalism and what's going on online. And you sort of portrayed Hollywood as, portraying the internet as a box, a television set. But also, if you look at traditional media online, they tend to be doing the same things and not fully exploiting the potential of interactivity or inner creativity or whatever you want to call it. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you've seen communities of journalists reconcile the need to have a sort of authority to tell the truth because that's what they're selling, and also embracing the internet.
The fear that is rampaging through the journalism business is beginning to concentrate people's minds, which is a good thing. It means that they're experimenting more. When I left the Mercury News in January, I was doubtful that big media would get it within a couple of years. I'm completely revising that. I think they're getting it much more quickly than I had anticipated. Clearly, the Mercury got it because they let me do a weblog starting in 1999. Of course, they didn't know what it was. But it was a place in an entrepreneurial culture that, and the question wasn't whether to do it, it was just would it hurt the journalism. And when I convinced them no, they said fine, let's have at it. More and more this is catching on. I think it's a business survival question in part for the mainstream media, that if they don't do this, they're dead. And I think that's one reason they will.
But if they do it, they're dead too.
No, I'm not going to say. We have to separate the questions about what's going on in journalism from the journalism perspective and the business side. The threat to the mainstream, the mass media, is not a journalistic threat. I mean, journalists are competitive and pretty talented. They can respond to competition in, I believe, a very good way, not solely by covering Michael Jackson trials and other stupid things to cover instead of big world events. There's good journalism as well and reaction to this flurry out on the web. The real question for journalists in mass media organizations is whether they're going to have jobs because the business side of the operation is getting clobbered by a host of competitors for advertising revenues. And each, newspaper, I'll talk just about newspapers here, though there are analogies in other media. but newspapers' revenue streams, of which there are many in the advertising bucket, each one of them is under attack from competitors who are well-financed, nimble, hungry, willing to live on lower margins than the mainstream media have become accustomed to. And this is important, and for whom doing journalism would be kind of a ridiculous distraction from the business. I don't know how to compete with that. I mean, what's in it for eBay to do journalism? They're the world's biggest classified advertising place. Why would they do journalism? It would be absurd. So that's the threat. It's not the journalism. But I do believe that people in journalism organizations who go into the communities of interest and geography in a really deep way, by listening to the citizens, bringing them into the process, have a chance to reestablish the bonds with their communities that in many cases they are chopping off deliberately themselves. And I want to see an ecosystem that keeps big media because it does important work. I would be very worried about a time of kind of an anarchy of trying to figure out what blog is telling the truth. That's not my ideal situation. I believe big media do important work, and I'm agnostic on who does citizen journalism as long as it gets done. And if big media want to adopt it, wonderful. It doesn't answer the business question. I don't have a good answer to that one. That's not a cyclical or easy economic question. It's a really tough one, as some in the room have already encountered. Yes, sir.
If the entire population was citizen journalists, why do we need journalism schools? Why aren't these people no more than we used to use 20 years, 30 years ago, tipsters? I give the bartender $10 and he told you what a movie star you.
Right, but 20, 30 years ago, the tipster didn't have a blog that he or she could use to put out the news without the journalist being involved. Certainly this is a continuation of long-standing trends. The idea of sending photos to big journalism organizations is not new. A Pulitzer Prize-winning picture from the 1930s of a truck hanging off a bridge was taken by a citizen journalist. This is not all new. What is new is the ubiquity of the medium, the increasing sophistication of the tools, and the understanding of people that if they have something to say, they can get it out there to a large group of folks who might want to pay attention. Again, I want to see an ecosystem that includes all of this, that is not replacement for any of it. And I don't see why we can't do that. I do.
And you talked about the need for and the lack of standards among citizen journalists and for blogs generally, more broadly than as an aid to those who receive their work. Do you see now a process by which those standards are even loosely developed and agreed on in a way that a reader could have a fairly good sense of what he or she was plugged into?
The question of standards in the blogosphere, for lack of, I don't want to oversimplify your question.
But that's,
well, first of all, bloggers agree on nothing, and will never agree on anything uniformly, except that they want to be blogging. Not every blog is journalism. We shouldn't imagine that every blog wants to be journalism. It's a conversation, not a... it's mostly not journalism, and most of it is a kind of wonderful noise. And I love the noise. In the journalism I care about, I'm trying to sort of help get some signal up above the noise so we have a higher signal ratio. To have standards that would work will have to be voluntary. That's first thing. I come back to, stuff that I'm doing is trying to get people to basically just pay attention to what goes into journalism, and to, in one little corner of the world where we're doing a little of it in a very experimental way, say if you're going to do journalism, well, you use your real name, and you agree that you'll basically adhere to 4 things that are kind of vague to begin with, but one is, well, not all vague, but accuracy, thoroughness, fairness, that is vague, that's hard to quantify, and transparency, so that if there's a bias going in, it's explained, so people know where you're coming from. And I don't think we're going to have, clear-cut ethics codes the way the kind that are, all over the web from every journalism organization on the planet. But I think we can start getting better voluntary training going for folks who care. And then there's another level where something is going to be technologically more interesting in the future. And that is, one thing the web is really good at is finding out what people are actually looking at. And that's the beginning of a reputation system. If you think of Google pointing to, Google says that basically, it's more complicated, but they say the thing at the top is what more people point to, which means it probably is more likely to be what you're looking for. With blogs, the more inbound links that you have to a blog, the more likely it is that you have some credibility built up over the years with among certain people. And again, these are corruptible and gameable systems, but they're the beginnings of things that people are working on technologically to help us find what people are recommending to each other. So it's really early. But I think we're going to combine human and machine recommendations to help us find the things we can trust. But the really important thing is that folks who read, and I'm using read in the broad sense, the people who are getting stuff from the web in the form of news need to actually do a little harder work than they've done in the analog world of journalism, which was where there were publications and broadcasts we've come to trust, or trust most of the way or some of the way. People have to tune their BS detectors a little bit more sensitively on the web, and they have to realize that not everything is credible. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of credulity among readers for things they should not have any reason to trust. So these things develop over time. I think in the next decade or so, we'll see some very interesting stuff to help people surface the good things that will, some of which will actually be very good for the established media, because it will be the fabled retreat to quality at some level.
This is going to have to be the last question.
Okay.
Related to the standards question, can you talk a little bit about Shield Law and maybe the Apple case that's under appeal? Right?
The Apple case, actually I have a horse in that race. Apple is suing several websites to try and get them to turn over the names of their sources for stories they did about Apple's upcoming products. At the request of lawyers in 2 of those cases, I have filed declarations saying that what they were doing was journalism. And filed those without being paid, I will also add. What's interesting is that the judge in the case ducked that issue after everyone thought that would be the core issue. Are they doing journalism or not? Well, the judge actually ruled so badly for news organizations in general that it woke up. He basically said, well, this is hyperbole, but from what I can read in that decision, the judge said if you take a stamp that says trade secret and put it on a press release, then the press can't report on it until you say it's okay to. And the big media organizations who ignored the case suddenly said, oh my God, this could affect us, and jumped in. And it's a terrible case, but I think the judge's decision was so ridiculous that it won't stand. But the bigger question I think you're getting at is, do bloggers deserve shield laws? Well, that raises two questions. One is, does anybody deserve shield laws? But if we agree that journalists deserve shields in some way, then we're going to have to change that question again to not who is a journalist, but what is the act of journalism. The shield should go with the act, not the person. It's going to be. Otherwise, we won't be able to handle it for a lot of reasons. One of which is that when the shield law starts saying who is a journalist, are we going to get judges and governments saying who is a journalist? That's the direct result of our thinking if we go that way. Whereas if it's the act of journalism, which could be anyone in this room or out on the street once in a year or in a lifetime. The guy in the London Underground with his cell phone and camera on the phone, that moment he was a journalist. So I think I'm involved with some folks at Stanford Law School on. I've been a part-time fellow up there at the law school Center for Internet Society. We're pulling a working group together with Larry Lessig and a few others to actually talk about this. Like the point being that we really would like the First Amendment to apply in cyberspace, and there's a lot of concern. But the people who I listen to on this, and I am not a lawyer, but the ones who convinced me have made it clear, I think, that in the future that we have to separate who is a journalist from what is an act of journalism and go that way. So
We have to wrap it up. We will have 2 more forums this fall on online journalism, so keep your eyes open. We'll be publicizing them, and please come back and let's thank our speakers.
thank you.